The world food price crisis was a major event affecting agriculture around 2007. The prices for some major agricultural commodities increased quite dramatically at this time, including rice, which went up by over 200%, maize, wheat and soybeans, which each went up by over 100%. And these price increases pushed an estimated 130 to 155 million more people into poverty around the world. On this graph, you can see the extent of these price increases. This is an index of food prices generally, and in 2007, 2008, there was this clear spike where the price was much greater than the prices had been before that, and in fact higher than it was immediately after that as well. High food prices caused significant political and social instability in a number of countries, including countries in Africa, in Asia, the Middle East, Latin America and the Caribbean. Why did it happen? A number of different reasons have been suggested by commentators, including increasing oil and energy prices, drought and climate change in various places, export restrictions, panic buying in some countries, increased demand for food in Asia, and biofuel policies in several countries. So I'll talk a little bit about each of those and try to give you some indication of which of these were the main causal factors. First, increasing oil and energy prices. Oil prices tripled between January 2007 and July 2008, and this would have contributed to higher cost of production, higher cost of processing and distribution for agricultural commodities. And we know from our understanding of supply and demand that an increase in an input cost like this would increase the marginal cost of production. And an increase in the marginal cost of production means that the supply curve moves up, as it does in this graph. We also know that an increasing supply curve or a rising supply curve like that causes an increase in the price. You can see in this graph the price increases from P1 to P2 as a result of the rise in the supply curve. At the same time, we can also see that the quantity of production also decreases from Q1 to Q2 due to the higher cost of production. What research has shown is that the contribution of this factor to the increase in prices was probably not that large. It may have played a role, but it probably wasn't one of the major factors. For example, we know that in 1998, energy prices doubled, but average food prices didn't change after that. So there's an example where which sort of illustrates that energy prices aren't really a dominant cost for agriculture. They are one of the costs, but they're not one of the main costs driving the cost of agricultural production. The other reason why we think it wasn't one of the main causal factors is that if it was one of the main factors, we would have expected the quantity of production to fall, as it does on this graph. You can see that the quantity of production fell due to the rise in the supply curve, but during the world food price crisis, we didn't observe any fall in production. So it probably wasn't one of the causal factors, at least not one of the main ones. The second factor I want to talk about is drought and climate change. There were a number of significant crop failures due to drought in some regions at around this time. Perhaps the most prominent example was in the Murray-Darling Basin in eastern Australia. That could have been a factor because Australia is the second largest wheat exporter in the world. It normally produces around 25 million tonnes of wheat each year, but the 2006 harvest was only about 10 million tonnes, so a very significant shortfall, at least for this country. And if that was one of the causal factors, then again we would have expected to see the supply curve moving upwards and to the left like it does in this graph, and that again would have contributed to higher prices and would have been associated with the lower quantities that we observed in Australia at that time. However, again, this probably wasn't one of the main contributors, because despite Australia's drought, the statistics show that there was no exceptional yield shortfall for the world as a whole. So there must have been some other countries where production was a bit above average to counterbalance the shortfall in Australia. And also in the early 1970s, we saw a huge spike in food prices, but no exceptional yield shortfall then either. So for those reasons, we don't think that drought, perhaps caused by climate change or perhaps just climate variability, we don't think that that was one of the main contributing factors in this case. The next one is export restrictions. In a desire to contain domestic prices, a number of countries decided to restrict their cereal exports to try and keep plenty of supply locally in their own countries to keep local prices down. And that included Argentina, China, India, Egypt, Pakistan, Russia, Ukraine and Vietnam. And at the international level, this graph would depict the world market, not the market within those individual countries, but outside that group of countries, that would have reduced supply somewhat and helped to push up prices. And we've already observed that there wasn't a really notable reduction in supply at the international level. So the contribution probably wasn't that big, but it probably did make some contribution. One analysis by economists from the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund suggested that prices would have been 13% lower without these restrictions. Not the major factor, but possibly one of the factors. Next was panic buying. A number of countries decided that they would try and buy up grain rapidly, more than they needed in the current year, to try and build up stocks to contain domestic prices. And that included Bangladesh, Nigeria, some Gulf countries and the Philippines. Unfortunately, this wasn't a well-implemented policy and it resulted in some quite large losses of food, wastage of food that went off in storage. And in the short term, what they would have done was push up the demand curve, as you can see here. And in this graph, I've got a very steep supply curve. I'm doing that, I've shown it that way because in the very short term, and this panic buying would have been something that happened in the short term, the ability to respond and change supply is quite limited. So the supply curve becomes quite steep. And that means that an increase in the demand curve, like we can see here, would have a significant increase in the price of a commodity. And you can see that that's happened in this graph. An increase in price from P1 to P2 and a smaller increase in the quantity from Q1 to Q2. We expect that this probably did make at least a temporary contribution to higher prices, but again, not the major factor. And we've observed that this panic buying has subsided subsequently, but you'll see later on in this segment that prices have remained reasonably high, or they've gone back to being high at times, even without this panic buying. So panic buying may have made a contribution, but probably, again, wasn't the major factor. The next one that's been proposed is increased demand for food in Asia. We know that there have been higher incomes in various Asian countries, particularly in China, and history shows us that when people in countries develop higher incomes, get higher incomes, they often increase their demand for meat, and that has been observed in China. And a higher demand for meat leads through to a higher demand for grain to be used to feed to animals. And for beef cattle, a particularly important feed grain is soybeans. If that happens, again, we would expect an increase in demand for grain. And you can see in this graph, we've got the demand curve moving upwards and to the right, and that's resulting in an increase in the price and an increase in the quantity of production. The evidence suggests that this probably did make a contribution to higher prices. And it was probably one of the more important factors that pushed prices up. But it didn't explain all of the price surge, it only explained part of it. And finally, biofuel policy. In certain countries, particularly Europe and the USA, there has been strong policy support for biofuel production. And these policies, in some cases, have led to food crops being diverted into production, away from food production, into production of biofuels. And the most prominent example of that would be maize in the US. If this is done on a big enough scale, this could really make a difference because one fuel tank full of ethanol is enough grain to feed a person for a year. And a lot of fuel tanks of ethanol have been used in the US starting at about that time. And again, this is an example of increasing demand, pushing up prices and quantities. So we've seen there are a whole variety of different factors that may have contributed to these rising prices that we saw in around 2006, 2007, 2008. Some of those factors relate to increased demand, some relate to lower supply, And some of them are actually caused by policy rather than events out in, in climate or things like that. So what I've argued, what I've said in this talk is that the evidence tends to suggest that the policy-related factors and the increased demand were more important than lower supply. And whatever combination of factors they were, they combined to cause large and rapid price increases, and we saw that they subsequently fell. However, they didn't stay low. They rose again quite quickly afterwards and have been volatile ever since, as you can see in this graph. They probably have stayed relatively high because some of the factors that I've talked about have also stayed in place, and they would be the export restrictions, increasing incomes in Asia, and biofuel policies, which are still influencing prices to this day. One of the questions that arises from this would be, is cheap food finished? We saw in an earlier talk, or a couple of earlier talks, I've mentioned that we've seen this long-term trend of declining prices for some major agricultural food commodities. But that's really different to what we observed in 2007. And is that a sign of things to come? And that's a question that I'll be looking at in more detail in the next segment. In summary then, the 2007 food crisis was a major spike in world prices for agricultural food commodities. It affected low-income people in developing countries quite severely. We've talked about 6 contributing factors that are related to policy, demand and supply, and concluded that the policy and demand related factors are probably the key ones.